Good morning and welcome to reflection number 4 on chapter 4 of Dugan. Chapter 4 is entitled Person-Centered Theories. Dugan has a lot to say here, so we'll start going through this. He covers off 4 distinct theories of leadership under this heading of person-centered theories. The first of them is what he calls trait theory. He discusses the leadership challenge. He discusses EQ, the idea of IQ and its counterpart EQ. We will talk about that. That it still lingers in discussions of leadership, still quite a popular point of view. And the fourth theory of leadership he discusses is what he calls strengths-based leadership. So without further ado, let us get started. I have a little bit of further ado. Just a slight note. Yesterday, when I was discussing critical theory, I mentioned Axel Honneth, who is a contemporary, he's still alive, a theorist in that tradition. And his name is Axel Honneth. I said Alex Honneth, so I somehow reversed the letters. I have a book of his here. I have no excuse. I should know it's Axel. In any case, neither here nor there. The first conception of leadership Dugan covers in chapter 4, as I mentioned, is trait-based leadership. And of all the different theories of leadership, I think this one should resonate most powerfully with you. Why do I say that? Because it's so ubiquitous, might be the word for it. Where do you see the trait-based theory of leadership? You see it with a vengeance in full-blown form. You see it in the great man theory. In the great man theory, if you need to learn the great man theory, just watch any action film coming out of Hollywood. It will have a great man theory in it, whether it's personified by The Rock or some Tom Cruise or someone else. There is almost always an appeal of some kind, explicit or implicit, in most cases explicit, to the great man. And the great man shows up and everything turns out well. I don't think we should be surprised by the ubiquity of the great man theory. We live in a society that still, in many respects, is patriarchal. So in patriarchy, is it a surprise that you would see over and over again placed on a kind of pedestal this theory of the great man? Now, the trait theory is related. Traits, by the way, Dugan points out, and I think it's worth keeping in mind, we tend to be a little bit loose with the terminology. So a trait, in most cases, a trait is a fixed feature. That is to say, it's a permanent feature or characteristic. So a trait is something that you have that stays with you. I think Dugan mentions that they can be altered or modified, but in the literature, a trait is treated in most cases as something stable and permanent. So it's a characteristic of, say, personality that remains over time. So with that said, Dugan does say that we often use certain terms interchangeably with the term trait. He mentions competency, for example, attribute, disposition. to be honest with you, if you go into an analysis of these different terms, they all have different connotations. So it becomes a bit of a soup or a tossed salad. That is to say, there's a proliferation of terminology. And when you see that, my advice is run for cover, because things will get confusing. Now, with that said, I wanted to point out how, in fact, he cites Zuccato, Kemp, and Bader. So let's listen to how they define what a trait is. And here I will cite them directly. Quote, a range of stable individual differences, including personality. I wouldn't think of personality as a trait, but in any case, personality, temperament, motives, cognitive abilities, skills, and expertise. So these are traits, right? In the sense that I just clarified. He then goes further, though, and I'm not quite sure I understand this. You will know the terms, if you've ever studied anatomy, you'll know the terms distal and proximal. You know, as I recall, our fingers are distal from the mid body. Our shoulder is proximal. I think it's something like that. You know, distal is farther away than proximal. I'll send you to the anatomy textbooks, figure that out. That's what I recall from my study years ago of anatomy, that these terms are borrowed. So distal attributes are more ingrained. So they're more stable and permanent in nature. Proximal attributes, by contrast, are more malleable and changeable. You know, you can alter them. So that's a distinction he draws inside the theory of personal traits. Now, I thought it was quite interesting that Dugan, and this is just by way of commenting on the text, Dugan says, under the subtitle of How Research Evolves the Concept, Dugan says, I don't think I'm being unfair by characterizing trait-based research as the, and listen to this, as the junkyard of leadership scholarship. Now, I find that very interesting. So we have the junkyard of leadership scholarship under the title of trait-based leadership. It's a pretty remarkable claim. And I find it even more remarkable because when I get to table 4.2 on page 90, what do I see? I see supported by substantial, this is under the title of strengths. So Dugan considers this a strength of the trait theory, supported, he says, under strengths, he says, supported by substantial empirical evidence demonstrating transferability of traits across contexts and importance in predicting leader emergence and effectiveness. What I find surprising about that is the idea that it's supported by substantial empirical evidence. I had the feeling, on the contrary, that this was the junkyard of leadership scholarship. So I'm not quite sure how I can reconcile those two claims. The claim on the one hand that this is it's a junkyard for scholarship, and yet we have substantial empirical support for claims made under this heading. I'm just not sure I understand that. He also says, and I will quote, there is simply so much trait-based research, so there's so much of it, that it becomes difficult to sort through and find the content that truly is of value. Well, that's what you'd expect in a junkyard, right? There are things of value in a junkyard, but you have to go get them. And it can take a fair bit of time. You know, you have to lift a lot of junk to get at those valuable items, whatever they are. So I I underscore this just because I find it a bit of a tension in the text itself. So let me make another note. I find the discussion on page 89 a little bit difficult to follow. I thought I would point that out and see whether you make sense of it. And if so, let me know in one of our Zoom sessions. The claim is the most rigorous research on biological connections to leadership involves studies of twins. Now, twin studies are very well known for a whole variety of reasons. And I won't go into the study itself, nor does Dugan, by the way. But the claim is that relatively consistent results across studies demonstrate that only 24% to 32% of leader emergence, defined as occupancy of a positional leader role, is a function of heredity. Now, I'm going to leave that alone and just let you think about it. A function of heredity? Give that some thought. I'm not suggesting it's wrong. I just find it a very puzzling claim. So give it some thought and let me know what you think. Now, he does point out about the great man theory, and it's worth, I think, reflecting on this. There is no doubt the great man theory perpetuates inequality by its very design. No doubt. I cannot stress enough how important it is to remember that because of the strength of these roots, great man approaches continue to influence conceptions of leadership today, as well as shape the types of traits considered worthy of study. There's no doubt about that. Despite all of this more sophisticated leadership theory, the great man theory is very evident in our culture, and it serves an ideological purpose. I'll let you reflect on that. And I'm going to pause this and see what happens. Pause. So let me turn now to the second leadership model or theory discussed here, the leadership challenge model. This is the work of Kouzes and Posner, and this work looks familiar. It is, I think, well studied, and in the field of leadership, there are a lot of people who would recognize this theory. This, I think, was a very prominent theory in the 2000s. So it was a theory that I had worked with. People would bring up in conversation. People would outline. If you look at table 4.3, it contains the principal components of the theory. I'll read them out. Model the way, and do take a look at this. This table is useful as it does give you a pretty adequate description of the theory. Model the way, inspire a shared vision. At least this theory recognizes that there are other people around in the world, right? So because the trait theory, it's pretty barren when it comes to the idea of relationships, of context. Now, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but Dugan will go after all four of these theories for failing to, and it's important to recognize, for failing to take account of context, of social location, right? Context and social location, I should say. So we know already that these theories are, if you will, defective or incomplete. But here we go. We have, I think, for the first time, a theory that most professionals have heard of, they recognize. The trait theory everyone knows. because as I said, it's ubiquitous. Just take a look around the world. This conception, by contrast, is far more layered and sophisticated, I would argue. By sophisticated, I just mean there's more to it. There's more thought packed into it. So the third element, challenge the process, enable others to act, encourage the heart. Now, encourage the heart sounds like the next theory in line, which is EQ. That's not what he calls it. He calls it EI, I believe. But most professionals refer to it as EQ, at least on the streets. That's how it's described under that title. So I won't go on about those elements I just read out. They're there in the table. Do look at them. I think it gives you a pretty good picture of this particular conception of leadership. I wanted to quote them here, and because I think this is a useful summary quote. Leadership is an identifiable set of skills and abilities that are available to anyone. And leaders, quote, leaders mobilize others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. And this means that fundamentally, leadership is a relationship. Now we'll go back down the road. We're going to talk about relationships, relational leadership. What we see here is a theory that's pretty comprehensive in scope. It points to others in the world. It talks about leadership in terms of relationships. It talks about inspiring others. It's obvious that the leader in this case is embedded within some kind of social context, although that context is not quite brought in to the picture in the way, say, Dugan would like it to be. So, so much for the concept itself. Again, I would look at the table 4.3 on page 91. And I think that gives you, as I mentioned, a pretty adequate picture of it. Now, Dugan has some criticism. He states some criticisms of it. There is a suggestion of universality behind the theory, that is to say that these 5 elements somehow represent universal features of leadership. And by that, I mean, you have a theory that can be applied in case A under circumstances X and Y, but you can also take it and apply it without modification to case B with circumstances S and T, right? So my point is, this is something that you can apply from case to case to case. So it has or claims to have, or purports to have, a certain universality. And that makes Dugan nervous, right? And I think the reason for that, believe it or not, is Dugan is very worried about any universal claim, right? Because his paradigm, critical social research, that paradigm is lingering above Dugan, right? He's subject to it too, right? We're all subject to paradigms. And so his paradigm is telling him, you should be suspicious of any type of universal claim. Universality of any kind should be questioned, if not resisted. That, I would argue, is his paradigm speaking for him. So, I mean, universal claims require special evidence, no question. But to rule them out, owing to your allegiance to a paradigm, that itself can be questioned, right? So our paradigms can become straitjackets. So that's something I would I would keep in mind. So let me see what else I can say here. I don't want to just repeat Dugan. So I wanted to make one more point here, if I may. He, on page 94, he assesses the strengths and weaknesses of the leadership challenge model. So take a look at that. His strengths and weaknesses are a little bit odd, but fine. I don't want to take issue with them here. I just find that at times they're a little bit stretched. And I think that's owing to the fact that he's trying to make things, he's trying to align things with his methodology. So at times it forces a bit of a stretch. So what I wanted to say, just that point about universalities on page 94. He talks about, however, any label, anything labeled as universal gives Dugan pause. So I just didn't want you to think that I was pulling that out of my head. Now we turn to number 3. I don't want to go on for long. The third theory is what Dugan calls emotionally intelligent leadership. Now, that, as I mentioned earlier, often comes across as EQ. Now, EQ, you can take a look at it. It's Daniel Goleman, and Goleman is very well known too. So if you're in leadership, say in the public service, you'll hear that name. People will come to meetings and say, well, you know, have you read Goleman, or have you considered EQ, or what have you? In the real world, I think the idea comes across as a kind of prescription to leaders. And it often comes across in this way: you need to work on your EQ. So EQ itself is a concept that needs to be spelled out, because when you tell someone, oh, you need to work on your EQ, unless you can be a bit more specific about what that means, there's a good chance you're just going to either offend or alienate the individual. You know, you need to work on your EQ. Well, what's that? It's your emotional quotient. It's the counterpart of your intelligence quotient, right? Whatever it says about me, it must say something important. So if you tell me I have low EQ, I might run somewhere and hide, right? So anyhow, so Dugan's right to say this. It's an important little point on page 95. Emotionally intelligent leadership represents a deep dive into a specific proximal trait believed to be essential for effective leadership. And that's what it is. And I would critique it, to be honest, on that ground alone, because it's often presented. This isn't so much a failure of the theory itself as it is a failure of the way in which the theory is often presented. It's often presented in the way I just said. Oh, you know, you need to work on your EQ. Well, the question I would have is, whatever EQ is, how does it relate to the other dimensions of leadership, right? So it's often not identified with the other dimensions of leadership. It's almost as if it stood alone. So as if it were in and of itself a complete theory of leadership. And it's not even close to that. It is, as Dugan said, a deep dive into a specific proximal trait, right? So what you get is, it's almost a form of, I hesitate to say this, of reductionism. And what I mean by that is, what's leadership? EQ. Is it anything else? It's EQ. Well, wait a minute. Isn't there more to it? It's EQ. So it can be, I think, a little bit dangerous to treat this idea as if it were, I want to call it, what should I call it? It's like the golden solution, right? This is what you need. You need EQ. Uh, so that most of us need EQ, right? So what is that saying? Anyhow, I'll let that go. So again, he goes after this idea too for the same reasons he will go after the others: lack of context, a lack of reference to social location, not much of a relational dimension to the concept. By the way, on page 96, table 4.5, you can see it's spelled out in quite a bit of detail. The under the title of Emotionally Intelligent Leadership Framework. Take a look at that. That's quite extensive. It's almost too much, I think. So when you approach this and you think of EQ, what you find here is the explosion of EQ into a whole set of different, I'm inclined to call them abilities or competencies, right? Emotional self-control, authenticity, flexibility, initiative. These are often, by the way, formulated as competencies, which gives them a rather different twist, I might add. Again, we have a table 4.6, strengths and weaknesses. Please take a look. This theory, again, was very popular. I hesitate to call EQ a theory because it's so rarely presented as a theory. But just as well, what we have here is a pretty explicit treatment of it in table 4.5. So please take a look. Again, that theory is very common, right? This is not something that's off in a closet somewhere. Most people who work in leadership are familiar with EQ. And with Kouzes and Posner, the leadership challenge, and of course, Great Man. Great Man lingers in our culture. So anyhow, the final notion that Dugan goes into is strengths-based leadership. He describes it as wildly popular across career sectors. I'm a little bit surprised at that description. Because I would not describe it as wildly popular, but that's neither here nor there. He mentions that this theory relies on a survey, the Clifton Strengths Finder survey. So there's a survey involved. He talks about strengths. He needs to make sense of the notion of strengths. And he cites Rath, who defines his strength as the ability to consistently provide near perfect performance. That's an interesting conception of strengths. Strengths have the potential, this is Dugan, to emerge in different areas based on dominant talent themes, which reflect, quote, naturally recurring patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior. This is on page 98, by the way. So Dugan gives us a bit of an explication of what a strength is. I mean, note how in case after case, we're using words to point at something. We were using words to point at traits, then at attributes, and now we're pointing at strengths. And the reason why I mention that is it shows you that these theories will depend sooner or later on how well they define those pointing terms, because you can't make sense of a theory based on strengths unless you can make sense of the term strengths. So this, I think, is part of what this theory attempts to do. It asks us to know our strengths. So you identify certain strengths and then you seek to cultivate them, right? So this theory is often applied, Dugan tells us, in the domain of recruitment. So when you're hiring, what are you looking for? What are your screening criteria? And a lot of organizations, I think Dugan is right, will look for certain strengths, right? They'll look to identify or tease out in interviewing or whatever the screening process is. They will look to identify certain strengths on the assumption that those strengths somehow facilitate the organizational purpose. So much for the idea of strengths. You have a table at 4.7 with a list of terms, and I'll let you look at that and reflect on it. Now, he does point out, and it's important to see on 101, and I quote him, more problematic, however, are some scholars' serious reservations regarding the way strengths are used and its research credibility. Now, I don't want to go into his criticism of the CSF, but take a look at it. He questions its reliability, as I recall, and it looks like he's right to do so. I, of course, in order to support that judgment, I'd have to go look at it myself. But his claim about reliability, let us for the moment take it for what it is. He has again, the notion of reliability, I think is a technical statistical notion. And if you need to know anything about it, let me know. In general, test is reliable if, as I recall, now I should check this and correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't done my statistics in years, but as I recall, a test, A, is reliable if on future applications of the test under similar testing conditions, the results of the test A, are similar to the results of test B, which are then similar to the results if it's the same test and the test is reliable. You would expect the results to be similar. So reliability is a term that describes, and I will check this, it describes the similarity of results in testing over time. So an unreliable test is a test that gives you one result and you apply it again in similar testing conditions and you get very different results. If that happens, you have an unreliable test. So let me double check that. And if there are any statisticians in our group, fire away, because that's not my domain. I did research, but I wouldn't claim to be a statistician. So if we have one and I'm wrong, let me know. He mentions reliability, by the way, on 102. It's there that he talks about reliability. And his claims are worth going through. If he's right, the CSF is not a very useful tool. So now let me get to the summary of the 4 positions, and then I'll conclude, as I don't want to go on forever. Oh, by the way, there's strengths and weaknesses, as you know, 4.8 table for the strengths-based notion of leadership. Take a look. I think his summary criticism would be this. He notes on 104, at this point, you've probably noticed at least 3 persistent themes among person-centered theories. They rarely reflect theory as traditionally defined, typically offering typologies or heuristics. If you need help with either one of those terms, typology or heuristics, let me know. In fact, I'll just tell you, typology is like a taxonomy. It's like a classification. It's a series of types. So you're trying to impose some kind of order in your thinking if you create a typology, right? What's the other term? A heuristic. A heuristic is a rule of thumb, right? So, how do I do this? Well, here's a rule of thumb. And a lot of leadership comes out that way as little rules of thumb. They're heuristics. Oh, you want to be a good leader? Polish your EQ. Oh, okay. That kind of thing. So that's the first thing he says. They rarely reflect theory as traditionally defined, typically offering typologies or heuristics. Empirical research supporting their assertions can vary substantially. Yes, yeah. Some of these theories, the great man theory, has almost no evidence at all. So yes, that would be typical of any class of theories. They will vary by empirical support. So they often, the third point, they often omit considerations associated with context, power, and social location that shape how leadership unfolds. I think this is the primary criticism. So please reflect on it. He spells it out in the rest of the chapter. He talks about a lack of process considerations. He reconstructs the person-centered theories. And I will be quite honest with you. I'm not quite certain why he's doing that. And I'll conclude perhaps with an explanation of that peculiar remark. You have deconstruction, in which you dismantle a theory and you examine it in a critical way. We've talked about that. But he wants to reconstruct these theories. So first, in this chapter 4, he deconstructs he doesn't deconstruct them. He spells them out. He presents the theories. But he does deconstruct them in a sense. What he does is he points out their weaknesses. He also points out their strengths. And by the way, that takes us back to something I said the very first day. A critique is positive and negative. So please keep that in mind. Dugan observes that standard, right? So when he critiques a theory, he says, here are the strengths, here are the weaknesses. Now, the weaknesses in these theories, we know what Dugan thinks. No context, no social location. They're not very layered. They leave out too much. They simplify things far too much. So those criticisms are pretty clear. Why he would then go on to reconstruct the theories is a little bit surprising to me. And again, I want to explain briefly why. Well, I deconstructed the theory. What did I find? It's got some strengths, but it has some serious weaknesses. And altogether, my conclusion would be this theory is not viable. It's not useful. And so I would expect him to run his critique and then say, well, we need to move on and find something better. But what he does is he reconstructs each of the theories. Well, fine. And I think what he does makes good sense up to a point. But what I would ask is, you've deconstructed the theories, you've shown them to be insufficient, and now you're reconstructing them. If you reconstruct them, are they going to be sufficient, or do they still carry the weaknesses of the preceding models? That is to say, the models before you reconstructed them, right? That's not clear to me. So I'm not sure I understand why he's reconstructing theories that perhaps should be put in the junkyard of the theory junkyard, right? Like, I'm just not sure I understand his reasoning. And again, I would say this, I think this is his methodology shaping his thinking, right? It's an interesting example. Why would you go on to reconstruct theories that you consider inadequate? Well, you do it to make them adequate, but you've already acknowledged that in essence, the logic of these theories is flawed. So why bother reconstructing them? What do you hope to get out of that? So anyhow, he has to do it because in his introduction, he sets out a methodology that says, I'm not just talking about deconstruction. This isn't just about negative critique. I'm going to talk about reconstruction. Now, you'll remember I went on about that for a little while. Derrida talks about deconstruction. Does he talk about reconstruction? Do you reconstruct what you've deconstructed? I'll just let that go. I know that all of this might sound a little bit too theoretical, but bear with me here. I just find the text is, I'm not saying this text is not a good text. It's a good text. I like it. But I think it has some peculiarities. So I just wanted to elucidate a few of those. Now, I wanted to read the chapter summary quote. Why? And I'll stop with that. Why? Because it should have been at the beginning of the chapter, I would argue. So here it is. There is a natural desire to want to simplify our complex world, to reduce it to terms we can understand, of course. Accordingly, we often see a search for the one feature that distinguishes the effective leader from the ineffective one. Yes, we look for that single point, that kind of golden leader, that golden trait, the one trait that will make the great leader. Yes, that's also reductionist. So if we could just find the feature, that one feature, we could adjust our selection and training or the developmental techniques to ensure that all our leaders had it. Right. In a very simplistic world, there would be one such feature. We'd go out, we'd find it, we'd stuff it into our leaders, and they'd become great leaders. It should be very clear to you how ridiculous this notion is. However, reality will not always accommodate our desire for simplicity. I would add a little strength to that claim. Reality will never accommodate our desire for simplicity. If it did, we could shut down all our science departments. There is no single trait or training technique that gives us the leaders we want. Correct. So that introduces pluralism into the conception of leadership, right? Now, with that, I think because I'm so concerned about taking up your time. Now, again, these are all optional, so I don't expect you to be listening. I hope you are so that I'm not alone, but that's my business, right? So I see these sessions as an opportunity to talk about the text. And I'm leaving it to you to go into the text and read it and figure it out. My comments are touching on aspects of the text here and there. So, however, let me close by saying, I think I've said it a dozen times, any questions, comments, criticisms, anything, just send me an email. I'm going to set up my email right now. So I'm hoping all of that works. Thanks for your time. Bye.